Okay, this is my screencast 1, and it is about learning disabilities and the timeline and history of them. So, a learning disability is defined as a group of neurological conditions that interfere with a person's learning. They're often referred to as LD. There are many different disorders that are encompassed under LD. These disorders are related to listening, speaking, reading, reasoning, and mathematical calculation. Oftentimes, these disabilities are not obvious and they can go unrecognized. This is a timeline of history of learning disabilities. So in 1937, Samuel Orton, who was a neuropathologist, came up with the term strepthocymbellia to describe an issue he saw with children who had difficulties with reading. This eventually led to the understanding of dyslexia. And then during the 1940s and 50s, medical research was very limited. If LD students received any help at all, they were usually just placed into classes for the retarded. And then from the 1960s and 70s, there were terms such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, and those began to be used. LD students actually began being placed in resource rooms during that time period. In 1963, the formation of Association for Children with Learning Disabilities occurred, so that group was made during that time. And then from 1980 to 2000, medical research began again on learning disabilities due to new technologies. And then there were genetic studies that began, and then there were new terms as well, so they stopped using the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, and they began using the terms reading disability, math disability, and writing disability. And LD students were served in a variety of settings rather than just being placed in resource rooms. They were in the gen ed settings, sometimes with additional accommodations. And then in 1990, Congress passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which we refer to as IDEA. And this refined services to those with disabilities. And then in 1997, IDEA was rewritten and they redid that a little bit. The next thing I have is the contributions of 5 leaders in the field of special education. So the first one was Samuel Orton, who I talked about during the last slide, and he was the one that came up with the term strepthocymbellia, and then we ended up learning about dyslexia because of his discoveries. The next one was William Cruikshank. He suggested that those being classified as retarded were actually showing normal intelligence when tested non-verbally, but they were struggling due to having deficits in perception and attention, not due to their intelligence. The next leader that we had was Samuel Kirk, who suggested the term learning disabled rather than the old term minimally brain damaged. And he did this at a meeting of concerned parents. That was in Chicago in 1963. The next leader in our field was B.F. Skinner, who was actually a psychologist. He researched animal and human behavior, and that led to the popularity of behavior modification during the 1960s. And then our last leader that we have is J.K. Torgerson, which is a researcher that suggested that reading disabilities were actually caused due to deficits in phonological awareness. So there was a law called 94-142, and it was passed by Congress in 1975. This is the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which ensures that all handicapped children from ages 3 to 21 will receive a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. Children with learning disabilities would be taught in gen ed classrooms unless their disabilities were too severe for them to make progress in that setting. One of the main problems with this legislation is that it did not help the schools by providing the funding necessary to provide these services to their students. Then, when it was expanded and retitled, it was now called IDEA, which we talked about during the timeline. and IDEA refined the definition of learning disabilities, which allowed for it to be more specific as to who it is included and excluded under the label of being learning disabled. There is another Civil Rights Act called Section 504. This was designed to help children who may not qualify as learning disabled under the standards set by IDEA. Section 504 mentions seven categories that may allow a children eligible for modifications or accommodations at school. The ones that they list are a drug or alcohol dependency, ADD or ADHD, health needs, communicable diseases, social maladjustment, a learning disorder without severe discrepancy, and if the student does already have a disability but they have been exited from the special education program. So with learning disabilities, there are factors that may cause them, and some of those factors are that it could be inherited, so that could be passed on from their parents. Another thing is that it could be due to complications during pregnancy, delivery, or prematurity. And then also going along with that, there could be prenatal conditions, or there could be use of teratogens, such as alcohol or tobacco, that could affect the child and end up with them having a learning disability, as well as birth trauma. And even after birth, they could have early childhood exposure to neurotoxins such as lead, arsenic, and mercury that could end up with them having a learning disability as well. There are also incidence factors, and it is hard to say exactly how many people have learning disabilities since the definition varies. So our definition in Michigan can be different from the definition they have in Canada. So there are many that have undiagnosed learning disabilities due to differences in standards from even state to state. Another thing is that there are many more boys being diagnosed with learning disabilities than girls, so there are 3 times the amount of boys being diagnosed than girls. This could be because boys are more susceptible to brain damage, but it also could be because boys tend to draw more attention to themselves by the teachers because they are more disruptive in class. There are some characteristics of learning disabilities. So one of them is perceptual deficits, which occur when the brain misinterprets sensory information. And there are also phonological deficits. So this is when they have trouble with reading, writing, and language. And with this, they need to have phonemic awareness, and they can set up intervention programs for students that may be at risk or already have reading disabilities with this, so maybe they can improve on that. There are also several co-occurring conditions that can be in conjunction with the learning disabilities. The first one being ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This one co-occurs with learning disability in 1 out of every 3 students. The symptoms of ADHD include impulsivity, inability to complete routine tasks, distractibility, inability to sit or stand still. They often blurt out in class. They have a low frustration tolerance. They overreact to stimuli. They have trouble sleeping as well, and they talk excessively, and they can't pay attention. There are more similar to that as well. The next disorder is conduct disorder, which can often co-occur with ADHD. And this one is when they exhibit the symptoms for ADHD as well as a lack of respect for others. They may do things like intentionally break rules, lie. They can be cruel to others or animals as well. And then our third condition that may co-occur with learning disabilities is Tourette's syndrome. This syndrome is a genetically inherited neurological disorder. And symptoms of this syndrome include involuntary motor tics or vocal tics. So sometimes they will have physical movements that are kind of random, or vocal tics, like they may yell out like random phrases. So there are programs and settings in the least restrictive environment that are from like birth to age 5, and then that changes from age 5 to age 21. So the programs can start even before birth if it is believed the baby could be at risk. So the local public school system can offer assistance to the parents, such as counseling, located needed services, and parenting advice. And if the baby is born and then it's identified between birth and 3 years of age, an early intervention team can evaluate the baby, and if needed, they can create an individualized family service plan that can be devised by state agencies. So then if it's identified as learning disabled between the ages of 3 to 5, there are services available through the local early intervention team. Services can be provided in the children's preschool, daycare, or even at home. So then those settings change from ages 5 to 21, and once they are enrolled in school, they can receive these services in multiple settings. So what they try to do is to allow the student to receive services in the least restrictive environment, and they want to keep the student in the general education setting if possible. So they can do that by like having them in the general education setting with a special ed personnel that could come into class and assist a student, or they can do that by the special educator meeting with the gen ed teacher to plan out a program for that student. There are other ways that a student can receive services that are less inclusive, such as a student going into a resource room where they can receive additional help for a part of their day. Or they could also be placed in a class specifically designed for LD students for the entire day or just maybe part of their day. If they only have like trouble with reading, then they could just be in that room for English rather than being there all day. Then the rest of their day could be spent in the gen ed setting. It's up to the student's IEP team to decide what the student needs in order to make progress academically. There are additional services available to students such as speech therapists or occupational therapists, and these services are determined by the IEP team, and they're available until the student turns 21. So with the brain, which is responsible for learning disabilities, it starts with the central nervous system, and that's the part of the body responsible for learning, and nerves throughout the body pick up signals and send messages through the spinal cord and then to the brain. The smallest part of the central nervous system is the neuron, and the neuron communicates messages from all throughout the body by use of neurotransmitters. So different parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. So the brainstem that controls all automatic functions such as breathing, heart rate, and digestion. The cerebellum controls all body movements such as posture and balance. The cerebral cortex controls all conscious activity, that's made up of 2 hemispheres, so it's actually contralateral. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa. And then those hemispheres are split up into different lobes. So the frontal lobe deals with problem solving. The temporal lobe deals with hearing and language. The parietal lobe deals with sensory information such as taste, touch, pressure, and pain. And the occipital lobe deals with visual information.